What happened to Five Nights at Freddy's? How did it go from this tense, dingy, claustrophobic horror game to, well, this buggy, unfinished, not even remotely scary mess of a game? How did it go from being called the scariest game in years to being the absolute laughingstock of the internet, and where did the downfall start? Was Five Nights at Freddy's ever scary to begin with, and will it ever return to its former glory? So what happened to Five Nights at Freddy's is a question that, in order to answer, we need to first talk about the creator of it, Scott Cawthon. Scott Cawthon's story is one of inspiration and resilience. Scott didn't just explode onto the scene with Five Nights 1, no, he had made over 70 games before ever releasing the first installment in the series that would go on to define his career. Before any of this, there was just Scott Cawthon, an inspiring developer and animator trying to make it big in the world. Being born in the late 70s in Houston, Texas, Scott was becoming an adult just as early computer animation would begin to be used in films and television shows. With the exception of massive budget films such as the first Toy Story, early computer generated graphics were simple and rudimentary, often liminal and surreal in their presentation. Movements were limited and uncanny, textures were often just a strange continuous image simply stretched out over basic models. There's a reason that the first Toy Story focused so much on the toys and avoided showing humans as much as possible. The technology was cumbersome to use and not advanced enough to depict humans properly. This is why, for the first presentable animations at the time, it took every shot hours to create. Because of this, Scott Cawthon's earliest creations were simple games with hand-drawn art styles. And when I say hand-drawn, I don't mean in the same vein as Cuphead. I mean the type of hand-drawn art that you would do in Microsoft Paint in the computer lab at school. These games were made in an engine that would go on to be called ClickTeam Fusion, an engine that's incredibly beginner-friendly, which eats the difficulties of creating and coding games. This style, however, wouldn't remain as Scott's primary art direction, as some of his early works involved simple 3D models and animation. A few of his early games, RPG Workshop Max, a lost RPG maker game tool thing, was made by Scott in 2002, and after this, 3D modeling would become Scott's primary output for his creative works. Scott had worked with 3D animation beforehand, independently creating the Bird Village saga of shorts, Mushnail, and its sequel Return to Mushnail in the late 90s. Being a man of faith, when it came to joining an animation studio, Scott opted to join the studio Hope Animation, a team of Christian animators and developers from around the globe who would produce Christian animated films. It's unclear if the other members of the team would aid Scott in his endeavors of creating video games, as their website is incredibly outdated and mostly only refers to them as animators. However, being around like-minded individuals and others with similar talents likely inspired Scott to continue to create. During his time at Hope Animation, Scott would create a fair few films, including one depicting the story of Noah and the flood, a couple that would teach the true meaning of Christmas.
That's not right at all. Hey! Why so blue? What?
And an 8-part series adapting the Pilgrim's Progress story. Scott seemed to enjoy this project so much that he then adapted his adaptation into a video game, creatively titled The Pilgrim's Progress, the video game. Even before Scott's religious work bleeded into his games, he had been making many games upon his own accord. Some of these stellar games include Doofus, which is, Could anyone explain what's going on here? The Fifth Paradox, which is one of the many early RPG games that Scott made, many which have been lost to time, and a lot more basic games, such as the Flan series of games. One of the earliest remaining pieces of Scott's shift to 3D modeling is Phantom Core, the Moon Mission, which sounds really badass at first, but in reality as well. The point here is that, in most years, Scott was churning out 3 or more games, and there wasn't a lot of control for quality. In 2012, however, Scott would slow down and focus on just one game, The Desolate Hope. Being a sequel to one of Scott's previous works, The Desolate Room, Scott planned to up the scale of this adventure. The plot of this game is about a structure that was left on another planet, abandoned by humans with the sole mission of simulating how to colonize and expand humans' reach onto this planet. There were 5 sentient robots sent to solve this problem. However, after not receiving any contact from Earth for over 30 years, these simulations have gone awry. Everything in this world is lifeless and mechanical. Environments are artificial approximations of that which you'd find on Earth. There are false imitations of animals, humans, and plants. Scott's art style was a perfect fit for a game like this. The uncanny, soulless look of a planet run by sentient robots left with too much time to think about how to preserve and expand the reach of Earth is incredibly bleak and oppressive. Everything is such obvious mechanical attempts at presenting biological, and you can really understand the sadness and desperation a program would be feeling trying to achieve the impossible, despite the fact that it's its only goal. Whether it be because Scott didn't have time between looking after his 2 children and working shifts at the Dollar General to learn newer forms of animation, or because Scott preferred the older style that was exploding when he first started his career, Scott would keep his art style consistent across games. And while this may have worked well in the Desolate Hope's favour, it tended to make a lot of his games look uncanny, outdated, and soulless unintentionally. After the release of The Desolate Hope, and alongside 30 other games, 9 of which were slot machine games weirdly enough, Scott would release Chipper & Sons Lumberco, a fun farming sim game that Scott would attempt to place on a Steam Greenlight. During this process, however, Scott's choice in design and animation would severely drag the game down. While it's been said that a majority of the reviews on its Steam Greenlight page touted the game's beaver characters as looking terrifying and mechanical, I can't actually seem to find any examples of this. It's likely that it did happen, however, as after just one day, Scott had taken down the Steam Greenlight page in the game's first trailer. Interestingly, perhaps the only remaining review from the time was from James Stephanie Sterling, who called the style dead, terrifying, and soulless. Sterling would also go on to compare the game's beaver characters to robots. For many, after having released over 70 games and 15 animations throughout the years, the continued failure and ridicule received would be enough to throw in the towel and accept that maybe you just weren't cut out for it. And initially, this is how Scott Cawthon felt. He fell into a deep depression and considered quitting his creative endeavors entirely. But he then found the Jerichode YouTube channel and subscriber at 1,000 subscribers. Yo, if you hit that subscribe button, it makes me feel good. Okay, thank you. Back to it. Scott decided that if the people thought his characters looked terrifying and soulless, he would give them something to be truly scared of. He would give them something terrifying.